Before the Second World War, Europe was home to roughly 9 to 12 million Jewish people. There were Jewish communities in every European country, but the largest Jewish population, more than 3 million, was in Poland. In the countries of Eastern Europe, Jewish communities formed an important part of life in all the big cities, as well as in many smaller towns and villages. It was a lively world that hummed with different ideas about how to live a good life. The majority continued to live their lives much as their parents and grandparents had before them. But others turned their backs on traditional beliefs and ways of life. Instead, they joined mainstream society or became members of political movements that held the promise of a brighter future, not only for Jewish people, but for mankind as a whole. So, across Europe, there were many different ways of being Jewish. There were Jewish people who were deeply religious, those who marked just a few religious festivals, and atheists who didn't believe in God at all. All belonged to a wider world that could be hostile, even dangerous.
Every year, on this evening of remembrance, we solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day here in Dublin. I invite Evelyn Byrne, Chairperson of Holocaust Education Trust Ireland, to address us.
Lord Mayor, Taoiseach, ministers, ambassadors, and friends. We remember the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, and the millions of others who perished because of ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, political affiliation, or religious beliefs. We acknowledge the trauma still felt in families of second and third generation, who still bear witness to the pain of the apocalypse that was the Holocaust. Today is a very personal journey for some. We hope that our ceremony restores to your loved ones in death the dignity that was denied them in life. We are here today to remember and never to forget. Mankind, who invented penicillin and saved lives, also showed the capacity to murder on a scale beyond our darkest nightmare. We are not here as victims or perpetrators or as bystanders, because in a world where racism and hate speech is on the rise, we should never allow ourselves to think that events like the Holocaust cannot be repeated. At Avian, the world was not prepared to act. We owe it to those who perished and to those yet unborn to create a world where people will never again look the other way, but will be active champions for humanity. That is the best testimony we can deliver to those who perished.
I invite our host, Lord Mayor of Dublin, Micheál McDonagh, to welcome you.
Is an hour mór dom fáilte chuir roimh chun an comór an náisiúnta seo, sa seomar crin staril I dteach an ard mhéara. Gach bliain ar an lá seo cuimhníonn míad orthu siúd a fórbás, agus orthu siúd a tháinig sláán as na campana agus na príosún, agus a dinis an éiringe don domhan, be cuimhne orthu go Joe. I welcome you to the historic round room of the Mansion House for National Holocaust Memorial Day. It's a great honour to host this event on behalf of the city and the people of Dublin. It's a special privilege to mark this day together with survivors and descendants of survivors of the Holocaust who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. Tonight, we recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people of Europe and those of other faiths persecuted during the Holocaust. Holocaust Memorial Day marks the date of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on 27th January 1945. It is fitting that we remember also those who suffered and died in their efforts to assist Jews and people of all religion and none, those demonized by the Nazis and marked for annihilation. This evening, Dublin joined cities and communities all over the world in this remembrance, and also in our pledge to work in solidarity with all those in our world today who suffer discrimination, racism, persecution, and genocide. I conclude by quoting the words of Holocaust survivor Piera Sonnino, who survived though her family were annihilated in Auschwitz. And she wrote, "Companions, friends, let us all work together so that no family on earth may ever experience my long night of Auschwitz, the long night of the martyrdom of my people and of all peoples."
I invite An Taoiseach Leo Varadkar TD to address us.
Lord Mayor, Ambassador, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honoured to be here this evening, particularly in the presence of survivors and families of those who survived the Holocaust and those who did not. And I want to thank the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland for the kind invitation to speak to you. This isn't my first time to attend the ceremony, but it is my first as Taoiseach, and I'm very pleased to do so. I want to acknowledge both the Office of the Lord Mayor of Dublin and the Government's Department of Justice and Equality, who support this event every year. Why do we remember? We remember because the horrors of the Holocaust, the Shoah, are seared on our consciousness, and we come together to affirm that we will never forget. We remember because it is a means of showing our solidarity and sharing our determination to honour the men, women and children who perished. And above all, we remember lest it happen again. The former Ireland Professor of Poetry, Harry Clifton, has written movingly about the 6 million people who were about to be exterminated in what he calls the real apocalypse. He describes the gas chambers, the steam rooms, the bathhouse stink, and reaches the profound conclusion in his words, "As the people of the book undressed themselves, I learned at last how to think." And remembering and studying events such as the Holocaust force us all to think. Due to the work of international scholars and national organisations like the Trust, we are able to honour the dead by remembering their lives and learning about what happened to them. We remember people like Etty Steinberg, who grew up and lived in Portobello in Dublin, not too far from here, who moved to the continent after her marriage. She was forced to go on the run with her husband and their young child Leon, and she and her family were arrested in 1942 and sent to Auschwitz, where they perished. Her story has been described by an Irish writer as a single tear in a veritable ocean of pain and suffering. So I'm delighted that the Irish Jewish Museum has erected a memorial to Etty and her son, both Irish citizens, who shared a humanity and a faith with millions of other citizens of Europe and around the world. I'm also greatly encouraged and enthused by the success of programmes run by the Trust as part of their effort to spread education about the Holocaust, especially the Crocus Project. That introduces young people to the subject of the Holocaust and raises awareness about the dangers of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and hatred. By planting yellow crocus bulbs, evoking the yellow Star of David, which Jewish people were forced to wear under Nazi rule, school children remember and learn about the 1.5 million Jewish children who perished in the Holocaust and the thousands of other children who were also victims of Nazi atrocities. We remember, of course, others who were taken to the death camps: gay men and lesbians, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, mixed-race children who were sterilised, and people seen as subhuman by the Nazis. The story of our state, the Irish state, during this period was rather a mixed one. The Taoiseach at the time, Eamon de Valera, should be commended for explicitly recognising the Jewish congregations in the new constitution, despite some criticism and opposition at the time. And that was a courageous stand to take during a particularly dark period of European history. And we know he personally intervened to try to help refugees often against the objections and obstacles of his own civil servants. However, the truth is that we as a state could have and should have done more. One of the preeminent scholars of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, has written about the catastrophe in terms of the perpetrators, the victims, and the bystanders. And I wonder if we also need to take a similar approach when facing the moral crises of the present. And the first step to understanding what happened in the 1930s is to recognise how it didn't happen overnight. Long before people lost their lives, Jewish people were first stripped of their social life, their right to participate in the economy, free speech, free association. The countries they lived in were occupied, their homes taken, daily life was restricted, and they were corralled into ghettos. They were excluded and silenced before they were exterminated. And we need to understand as well how they became victims so we can intervene when others are treated in the same way. And we also need to recognise when we are the bystanders, because the moral quandary of the bystander is ever present. And the most difficult thing, of course, is to try to understand the perpetrators, why they did what they did and behaved as they did. And I think it's only if we understand those who commit atrocities that we have a better chance of stopping them from happening again. So we must use the memory of what happened during that period to ensure a similar event does not befall humanity again. The threat of terror in today's world understandably causes people to be afraid, and that fear can cause people to look for someone or some group to blame. So we must conquer fear so that it does not open the door to racism, nationalism, or prejudice. Today in Ireland we offer welcome on our shores to refugees from war-torn regions such as Syria, and we also extend our support outward through development and humanitarian assistance and through the service abroad of our peacekeepers among our defence forces. Former President Mary Robinson opined that today's human rights violations are the causes of tomorrow's conflicts. And this year, as you know, marks the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This milestone document set out for the first time that fundamental human rights were to be universally protected. It was drafted as a response to the horrors of the Second World War and an expression of the will of our international community to make sure that such atrocities would be prevented in future. I want to conclude once again by saying how humbled I am to be in the presence today of survivors and their families. Today reminds us of the importance of educating ourselves about the Holocaust and also allows us to reaffirm our shared principle that hatred and prejudice should have no hold in our country or anywhere in the world. The great Irish writer Samuel Beckett joined the resistance in Paris in 1941. He was profoundly influenced by the Holocaust and all that he saw in that period. After the war, he volunteered with the Red Cross and wrote about how he had discovered a humanity in ruins. And to me, that's what the Holocaust represents: humanity in ruins, an act without conscience. And with each generation, we work to rebuild and repair what was destroyed, but we can never recover what was lost and those who were lost. All we can do is share a warning from history and send a message of hope that will resonate for all time. And we do that tonight. Thank you.
Ireland was among 48 nations that signed the Stockholm Declaration in the year 2000. This was an international agreement between governments to commemorate and educate about the Holocaust and to commit to combating all forms of racism. I invite Martina Feeney, Director of the Human Rights Unit at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and head of the Irish delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to read a summary from this important document.
We, the governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, recognise that it was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century, a crisis for Europe and a universal catastrophe. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. After more than half a century, it remains an event close enough in time that survivors can still bear witness to the horrors that engulfed the Jewish people. The terrible suffering of millions of Jews and other victims of the Nazis has left an indelible stain across Europe that must forever be seared in our collective memory. The selfless sacrifices of those who defied the Nazis and sometimes gave their own lives to protect or rescue Holocaust victims must also be inscribed in our hearts. We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education, remembrance, and research about the Holocaust in our schools, universities, communities, and other institutions. With humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred, we commit to fight against these evils and to reaffirm our common aspiration for a democratic and tolerant society free of prejudice and other forms of bigotry.
The Nuremberg Laws, drawn up in 1935, were designed to penalise the Jewish people and to make them disappear from German society. I invite Minister for Justice and Equality, Charles Flanagan, TD, to give his reading.
The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 deprived German Jews of their German citizenship. They also prohibited Jewish people from marrying non-Jewish Germans, and for the first time, Jews were defined as a race. German Jews were no longer recognised as members of the German population. The Nuremberg Laws did not define a Jew as someone with particular religious beliefs. Instead, anyone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was defined as a Jew, regardless of whether that individual identified himself or herself as Jewish or belonging to the Jewish religious community. Many Germans who had not practiced Judaism for years found themselves caught in the grip of Nazi terror. Even people who had converted to Christianity many generations before were defined as Jews. Jews were quickly sacked from their places of work, no longer able to serve in academia, in the civil service, in the media, or in the military. Other ordinances to the laws further disenfranchised Jewish people and deprived them of most of their civil rights and their human rights.
small number of Jewish Holocaust survivors live in Ireland. All of them were children during the time of the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. Tommy Reichenthal came to Ireland in 1959. I invite him to tell his story.
I'm here today not because who I am, but because what I am. I am a Jew and a survivor of the Holocaust. I was born in Slovakia in 1935. I was just 9 years old when I was captured by the Nazis along with my mother, brother, grandmother, and cousin. We were herded into a cattle cart, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy or hygiene. Stench and conditions were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 days and nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were open, and we were greeted by a shout from the SS with gun pointing and barking dogs. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guards, the cold and disease. People who were just skin and bone and looked like living skeletons were walking around very slowly, some of them dropping to the ground, never to get up again. They were dying in the hundreds, their emaciated bodies left where they fell or thrown into heaps. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. For many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves on the barbed wire at night to be shot in order to put an end to their misery. We found their corpses there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass graves. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust.
Gradually, Jewish people were squeezed out of German society. I invite Anna Maria Briero, director of the Tom Lantos Institute for Human Rights in Budapest, to give her reading.
The book burnings of 1933 heralded the Nazi policy to ban anything associated with Jewish people. Jewish religious books and books by Jewish authors were burned in public bonfires, along with other authors condemned as un-German. Jewish composers, musicians, artists, film and theater directors were sacked. Jewish businesses were appropriated by the Nazi state, and Jewish banks and bank accounts belonging to Jews were confiscated. Jewish doctors were forbidden to treat non-Jews, and Jewish lawyers were not permitted to practice law. Jews were no longer allowed in public places such as cafes, cinemas, theaters, swimming pools, or ice rinks. They could no longer sit on park benches which had "Not for Jews" stenciled on them. Jewish people were not allowed in restaurants, bars, bookshops, or barbers. They couldn't ride on trams or go to the opera. Even if they could, they would not hear music written by Jews, played by Jews, or sung by Jews. The Nazi police were everywhere, preventing Jews from going wherever they had always been able to go.
By July 1938, as pressure increased on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands, hundreds of thousands tried to flee. President Roosevelt convened an international conference in France to consider the unfolding Jewish refugee crisis. I invite Brian Killoran, CEO of the Immigrant Council of Ireland, to tell us about the Evian conference and its parallels in our world today.
"32 countries were represented at the Evian conference, including Ireland, where delegates were asked if they would accept Jewish refugees. Most countries said they had no room for Jews or that their quotas were already full. One country even stated that no Jew is too many. With nowhere to turn, the Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders. Today, as the world debates the difficulties arising from vast numbers of refugees requesting asylum in Europe, we are reminded of similar discussions that took place during the years of the Holocaust, some 80 years ago. Images of boats crossing the Mediterranean crammed with desperate refugees remind us of similar voyages undertaken by Jewish refugees during the Second World War. The St. Louis set sail from Hamburg in 1939, bound for the United States, with 937 Jewish people on board. The promised US visas never materialized, and permission to land in the US was rescinded. The ship was forced to return to Europe, where a great many of its passengers eventually perished in the Holocaust. The Struma, which set sail for Turkey in 1942 with 769 Jewish passengers on board, was stranded in Istanbul harbour. It was denied assistance and was eventually sunk in the Black Sea, with all but one of the refugees drowned. Today, people are still fleeing persecution, tyranny, and war. They are embarking on perilous journeys, desperate to find refuge somewhere safe. Not a lot has changed since the years of the Holocaust.
The state-sanctioned violence of Kristallnacht on the 9th of November 1938 marked a turning point in Nazi persecution of the Jewish people. I invite Anastasia Crickley of the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to tell us about the November pogrom.
Kristallnacht erupted across Germany and Austria as the police, Hitler Youth and locals rampaged through the streets on that November night. Hundreds of synagogues, Jewish homes, schools and businesses were destroyed and set ablaze. Windows were smashed, leaving the streets strewn with glass. Over 1,000 Jews were beaten to death or committed suicide afterwards out of despair. Some 35,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated and thousands of apartments and shops belonging to Jews were looted. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for the damage. The horrific violence that took place during Kristallnacht impacted profoundly on the Jewish communities as a portent of what might lie ahead. It convinced them that they were in imminent danger.
I invite Leonard Abrahamson, President of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, to tell us about the rules of identification introduced by the Nazis. Conor Macquarie will read from the diary of 15-year-old Yitzhak from Vilna about wearing the yellow star.
The Nazis forced Jewish people to wear identifying marks. Yellow stars of David to be worn as badges, or white armbands with blue stars on them. Like everyone in Germany, Jews were required to carry identity papers, but special identifying marks were added to those of Jewish people. A large letter J was stamped on their passports, and the middle names of Sarah for females and Israel for males were introduced. This enabled the police to easily identify Jews.
The decree was issued that the Vilna Jewish population must put on badges front and back. I was ashamed to appear in them on the street, not because it would notice that I would be a Jew, but because I was ashamed of what they were doing to us. I was ashamed of our helplessness. It hurt me that I saw absolutely no way out.
More than 1,300 ghettos were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. I invite Oliver Sears, who is second generation and board member of HETI, to give his reading.
It is estimated that approximately 1 million Jewish people died in the ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by the Germans. They were usually established in poor and run-down areas of cities and large towns, with little sanitation, chronic overcrowding, and starvation rations. Ghettos were often located close to railways and often near killing sites or death camps. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and Jews who left them without permission were severely punished. The brutality, starvation, overcrowding, and disease all contributed to the death toll. Although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of the ghetto populations were murdered, and there were few survivors. This photograph of my mother that you see behind me was taken in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941. One day she was marched with her mother and others to the railway station. On the way, they were made to wait in a tunnel that was sealed off. It was pitch black and no one knew what was happening. After about 20 minutes, the doors opened and they were herded onto a train destined for Treblinka. She would have been gassed on arrival had her mother not thrown her from the moving train, having bribed a guard to unlock a window. In 1990, I discovered that the tunnel had in fact been used as a crude gas chamber, fed by exhaust fumes from a tank or a lorry. That day, the engine must have broken down. My mother is one of the very few survivors to escape 2 gas chambers in one day. These days, she lives in Chile, where she enjoys the sunshine and plays Scrabble online. 14 games simultaneously. She usually wins.
On the 24th of June, 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany. The country was divided into 2 regions, the northern part, including Paris, under direct German rule, the southern so-called Free Zone, under the command of General Marshal Pétain, based in Vichy. 25% of the Jewish population of France, some 77,000 Jews living in French territories, perished in concentration camps and killing centers during the Holocaust. I invite Yoram Tokar from Étampes, near Paris, to give his reading.
On the 16th and 17th of July 1942, the infamous roundup of Jewish people in Paris, La Rafle du Vélodrome d'Hiver, took place. French police arrested 12,884 Jews, including 4,051 children. The roundup was codenamed Operation Spring Breeze. The Jewish men, women, and children were brought to the Vélodrome d'Hiver, a stadium in Paris designed for indoor winter cycle races. They were kept there in inhuman condition for 5 days without adequate food, water, or sanitary facilities. Parisians living nearby could hear the wailing and screaming day and night. Eventually, they were transferred to Drancy transit camp, where the children were immediately separated from their parents, who, in turn, were deported to Auschwitz. Many of the children stayed for several weeks in Drancy, where a large number of them died. Finally, they, too, were loaded into cattle trucks and sent directly to Auschwitz, where most of them were gassed on arrival. My family was torn apart by La Rafle du Vélodrome d'Hiver. My grandmother, brother, and sister, David, who was 21 years old, and Janet, who was 19 years old, were visiting their uncle and aunt, Paul and Sarah Talma, in Paris. They were amongst the Jewish citizen roundup during La Rafle. Great-uncle David died in Drancy transit camp. Paul and Sarah Talma, along with my great-aunt Janet, were sent from Drancy to Auschwitz. Their lives ended there in the gas chamber in August 1942.
I invite Dermot Lacey of Dublin City Council to tell us about the camp system operated by the SS. Serena Ryan will read from the diary of 14-year-old Kitty from Poland.
There were thousands of concentration camps, slave labour camps, and transit camps throughout the territories of the Third Reich. Jews and others incarcerated in these camps were worked or beaten to death or perished from brutality, exhaustion, cold, hunger, or disease. 6 death camps were established by the Nazis, all of them on Polish soil, where approximately 3 million Jews and thousands of other victims were murdered in gas chambers. Prisoners were selected to live or to die. 90% were selected for death. They were ushered into undressing areas where they were told to leave their clothes neatly on the numbered pegs, to tie their shoes together to make them easier to find when they came back from the showers. They never came back. Their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were sorted and sold in markets back in Germany. Human hair was used in the manufacture of textiles. This systematic industrial process of murder was unprecedented in human history.
As evening came, the whole sky was red. Smoke and flames were pouring out of all the chimneys. None of us slept that night. It was no longer possible to pretend, even to yourself, that the stories were not really true. All that we had heard and guessed was now before our eyes. Here were the death factories.
When the German army invaded Russia in June 1941, it was followed by killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. I invite Tom Hanley, former principal of Stratford National School, to give the reading about the killing squads operating in the Eastern Territories.
The killing squads rounded up Jews in the shtetls, towns and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests and ravines, where they were murdered in their thousands at point-blank range. Many had to dig their own graves before being shot into them. Entire communities were annihilated. It is estimated that 2 million Jews were murdered in this face-to-face killing by the Einsatzgruppen.
Holocaust survivor Jan Kaminski from Bilgoraj in Poland was 10 years old when the Jewish population of his native village was murdered by the killing squads in 1942. I invite his daughter, Jadzia Kaminska, to read Jan's story. Jan is also here with us this evening.
My name is Jan Kaminski, but I was born Chaim Schulzibner on the 30th of March 1932 in the town of Bilgoraj in eastern Poland. There were 6 in my family, my parents, my 2 sisters, and my baby brother. At the time, 5,000 Jews lived in Bilgoraj, which is more than half the population of the town. As Nazi killing squads swept through the region, my family and I were incarcerated in a ghetto in the centre of the small town. Later, on the 3rd and 9th of November 1942, the Jewish population of Bilgoraj was dispatched to certain and immediate death in Belzak death camp located 70 kilometres away. During one of these actions to liquidate the Jewish people of Bilgoraj, I fled to a nearby forest and became permanently separated from my family. It was no longer safe for me to identify myself as Jewish, and I adopted the name Jan Kaminski. I survived the war on the run, foraging and hiding in woods, living off farms, and keeping my identity concealed. In mid-1944, I linked up with the Russian Army Polish Corps and became a child soldier in the 21st Artillery Regiment. After liberation, I spent time in Europe before eventually coming to England and then Ireland as a political refugee. At the war's end, my entire family had been wiped out. My parents, Suzlem and Mindla, my sisters, Hannah, Matla and Rivka, and my baby brother had all disappeared. Anti-Semitism still prevailed in Poland and elsewhere, and pogroms against Jews still took place. It was impossible to think of rebuilding my life in Poland, which was also under Soviet occupation after the war. Following the withdrawal of Soviet forces and the liberation of Poland in 1989, there is a modest project of Jewish revival taking place in Bilgoraj. I too searched for my family, finding some direct descendants living in Berlin, but no trace of my immediate family.
Word reached Berlin that some members of the killing squads found their work distressing. They asked head office to find a more efficient way of murdering Jews. This prompted the convening of a special conference to discuss the issue. I invite John Roycroft of the Irish Refugee Protection Programme to give his reading.
On 20 January 1942, 15 high-ranking Nazi and government officials were invited by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, to a conference in a lakeside villa at Wannsee, outside Berlin. He asked the delegates to endorse Hitler's plans to introduce mechanisms for the total annihilation of the Jewish people of Europe. Adolf Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the number of Jews living in each European country whom the Nazis intended to annihilate. Ireland appears in the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The delegates debated at length who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement, euphemisms for murder. They concluded that a more efficient method of killing was necessary, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killings. Over fine food, brandy and cigars, it took the delegates less than 2 hours to unanimously endorse Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of the Jewish people by poison gas.
Some 48,000 Jewish people were living in Italy at the outbreak of World War II. Systematic arrests and deportations of Italian Jews to the concentration and death camps began in 1943. Estimates suggest that about 10,000 Jews were deported. The majority of them perished in Auschwitz. I invite Carina Camarino to tell us about her grandfather.
I come from a long line of Jewish tailors, teachers, and textile dealers. My grandfather, Enzo Camarino, survived Auschwitz. He and his family were taken from their home in Rome on the 16th of October, 1943. The day he arrived at the camp was the last time he ever saw his mother, sister, and uncle. They were gassed. The number 158509 was tattooed in blue on his arm when he got off the cattle car. After more than a year in the camp, his father collapsed and died in front of him from overwork and exposure. Enzo and his brother Luciano escaped Auschwitz just before its liberation in 1945. He found his way back to Rome by hitching a ride with a passing truck carrying coffee beans to Italy. He started life over in Rome, got married, and my father Italo was born. He then moved the family to Canada, where there was more opportunity. My father grew up in the area of Montreal, where the Italian immigrants bordered the Orthodox Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Even among other Jewish people, my grandfather never wanted anyone to know our family was Jewish because of his fears of anti-Semitism. It was as if he suffered for being Jewish, so the rest of us would not have to. I came to live in Dublin 15 years ago. Because Enzo survived, and people like him survived, I have never been afraid to say I am a Jew.
I invite Rabbi Dr. Charles Middleborough of the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation to give his reading about the uniqueness of the Holocaust for the Jewish people.
The final solution was a systematic attempt by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe, stretching as far north as Norway, as far south as Rhodes, as far east as Russia, and as far west as Ireland. They also included those Jews living in the countries of North Africa. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of these victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims. But as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Each victim has a name. Several people living in Ireland, Jews and non-Jews, lost cherished family members in the Holocaust, whose names we have included in the scroll of names. For some of them, we know their place of birth, their country of origin, their age, and their place of death. For others, we have only a name. But every victim has a name. In this small way, we honour their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. I invite pupils of Stratford College, Dublin, St Aloysius College, Carrigtwohill, County Cork, St Dominic's College, Ballyfermot, Dublin, St Gerald's College, Castlebar, County Mayo, to read from the scroll of names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gisela Molnar, Sander Molnar, Baila Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Ruchla Orzel, Feivel Orzel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Tauba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abe Tzvi Urbach,
Mordecai Urbach,
Gitla Freda
Rushla
Urbach,
Golda Urbach, Sarah Urbach, Hiel Urbach, Hyman Urbach, Nukum Urbach, Feigla Urbach, Perla Urbach, Frametta Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frankel,
Fritz
Kurt
Frankel,
Frankel,
Zygmunt
Walter Frankel,
Salomon
Herbert
Del Monte,
Frankel,
Caroline Wolf, Martin Wolf, Wolfgang Wolf, Sally Wolf, Henrietta Wolf, Rosetta Wolf, Elie Velvel Avasansky, David Philip, Recha Philip, Leopold Philip,
Valeria
Julia Philip,
Rosalia
Dagbert
Shaimovich,
Philip,
Julius Mayer, Geza Surrey, Oscar Shaimovich, Adela Fried, Bella Fried, Katerina Fried, Agnes Fried, Ezekiel Reichenthal, Katerina Reichenthal,
E.B.
Kalmar
Reichenthal,
Reichenthal,
Desida
Ilona
Reichenthal,
Reichenthal,
Ferdinand
Gisela
Alt,
Reichenthal,
Renka Alt, Erna Elbert, Marta Elbert, Joseph Drexler, Bedriska Drexler, Paul Drexler, Misha Drexler, Bella Perlberg, Irma Popper, Yora
Kalman
Matea,
Rosenthal,
Efisha
Eleonora
Matea,
Rosenthal,
and Keisha Matea.
Abraham Sustiel, Poland Sustiel, David Sustiel, Shimon Sustiel, Regina Sustiel, Rapé Sustiel, Marta Sustiel, Shabtai Sustiel, Lucy Sustiel, Mashi Yom Tov Sustiel, Adela Sustiel,
Sustiel children,
Agedni
Heinrich
Sustiel
Heimbach,
Brudo,
Zelma
Emmanuel
Heimbach,
Brudo,
Zaintje Heimbach, Rivka Zaks, Burrell Zaks, Cece Zaks, Nachman Zaks, Hannah Zaks, Aaron Zaks, Hannah Zir, Joel Dov Zaks, Bendit Zaks,
Shoshana Zaks,
Leah Zadak,
Shayna Zaks,
Gittel Zaks,
Masha Zaks, Rosa Zaks, Tyler Feig Fackler, David Major Fackler, Moshe Fackler, Gayla Fackler, Shindel Melechman, Yekiel Melechman, Theo Melechman, Joseph Melechman, Pepi Gerzib, Chaya Melechman, Yokovet Melechman,
Mame Alt Melechman, Levi Falker, Izzy Falker, Nathan Falker, Johanna Carlsberg Summer, Emil Summer, Etty Steinberg, Leon Gluck, Wojciech Gluck, Atzel Abram, Belia Abram, Osiah Joseph Abram.
Ida Cohn, Heinrich Herbst, Caroline Herbst, Els Zimak, Denny Zimak, Abraham Humberg, Emma Humberg, Gerda Feist, Fanny Kaufmann, Adolf Humberg, Raphael German, Karl German, David German, Chana Matla Zibner, Rivka Zibner, Baby Zibner, Mindla Zibner,
Shuram Zibner, Frandla Zibner, Doshra Frandla Zibner, Scheindla Zibner, Joseph Zibner, Mendel Kurzner, Sheena Bella Kurzner, Ovsi Kurzner, Sheena Riva Kurzner, Shifra Kurzner, Rashk Kurzner, Yanko Kurzner, Wanda Camerino, Renato Di Cori, Italo Camerino,
Naftalovic,
Julia Di Cori,
Sidonia Naftalovica, Hani Moskovica, Haim Moskovic, Benjamin Moskovic, Marek Moskovic, Yitzhor Moskovic, Shimson Hertz, Kayla Hertz, Shindel Hertz, Avram Hertz, Roisa Hertz, Yosef Hertz, Lieb Hertz, Meir Rohofsky, Rachel Rohofsky, Kayla Rohofsky, Hirsch Rohofsky.
When liberation came at last, it was not always joyful for the survivors. I invite Judith Woodworth of the Alfred Beit Foundation and National St. Patrick's Festival to read from the diary of Shmuel Krakowski from Poland. Orla Hannon will share the hopes of 14-year-old Donia Rosen from Galicia about the future.
Although we had seen a lot and experienced the worst, we still had hoped, still had dreamed. All those days we had struggled to survive, hour after hour, day after day, there had been no time to grasp the enormity of our tragedy. Now everything became clear. No longer were our families waiting for us, no homes to go to. For us, the victory came too late, much too late.
I ask you not to forget the deceased. I ask you to build a memorial in our names, a monument reaching up to the heavens that the entire world might see. Not a monument of marble or stone, but one of good deeds. For I believe, with full and perfect faith, that only such a monument can promise you and your children a better future. Only thus can we be sure that the evil that overturned the world and made our lives like hell will never return.
Dr. Bob Collis worked as a volunteer doctor in the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp immediately after the war. He brought 6 orphans back with him to Ireland. Among those children were brother and sister Terry and Susie, who Bob arranged to have adopted by a Jewish couple, Willie and Elsie Samuels. I invite Holocaust survivor Susie Diamond to tell us her story.
I was born Susie Molnar in Hungary in 1942. We were a small family comprising my mother Gazella, my father Sandor, my brother Terry, and myself. In 1944, Adolf Eichmann oversaw the roundup and deportation of more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where most of them perished in the gas chambers. During those months, the Gestapo came for my mother, brother, and me. We were deported first to Ravensbrück and then to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. My father had been forcibly conscripted into the slave labor service of the Hungarian army and deported to the Soviet Union, where he died in 1943. My mother died shortly after liberation. Terry and I were very young children when we came to Ireland. We grew up believing we were the only 2 members of our family to have survived. In 2007, Terry passed away, and I was the only one left. But a couple of years ago, my story changed when I was contacted by someone in Hungary who turned out to be my first cousin. He was born after the war and filled in some family details for me. There were 4 brothers in my father's family who lived in the small town of Korzak, about 100 miles from Budapest, where they ran a timber business. 2 of the brothers perished in the Holocaust and 2 survived. I have since learned that I have other first cousins in Hungary and in the United States. In the past couple of years, I visited Korzak, where I saw my grandfather's house, the Jewish cemetery where my grandparents are buried, and the synagogue where all my family prayed. 778 Jews lived in Korzak before the war. 461 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. There is a memorial scroll on the synagogue wall recording the Jews from Korzak who perished in the Holocaust. My family is listed on this scroll, but it has to be corrected because my brother and I survived.
Another brother and sister who Bob Collis brought back to Ireland from Bergen-Belsen were Zoltan and Edith Zinn Collis, who Bob reared in his own home and who took Bob's name as part of their own. They lived fulfilling lives in Ireland for more than 60 years. They both passed away in December 2012, leaving behind their Irish families, many of whom are with us here this evening. I invite one of Zoltan's daughters, Nicola, to give her reading.
Our dad, Zoltan, came from Czechoslovakia. He and his sister Edith were the only survivors of their family. By coincidence, they had met Susie and Terry in Bergen-Belsen as very young children, and our two families have been in touch ever since. Growing up in Ireland, we were the only pupils in our school who could spell Czechoslovakia properly. Survivors of the Holocaust have very few relations. We have got used to having very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, no cousins. We have been born with the title second generation, and this brings with an important responsibility: to transmit the memory of the Holocaust to future generations. But we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our new families, our children, and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both of our parents survived, and we are here, living our lives, looking towards the future.
In 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Authority in Israel, inaugurated the Award of Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. I invite the writer and journalist Clodagh Finn to tell us about these heroic people.
Only a fraction of the Jewish people were saved, and yet thousands of people in every country occupied by the Third Reich risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust, often putting their own families at risk. There were over 26,000 names of righteous listed in the Yad Vashem records, but the true number is probably double that figure. Mary Elms, an Irish woman from Cork and a scholar of Trinity College Dublin, had worked with Quakers during the Spanish Civil War. She joined hundreds of refugees who fled over the Pyrenees into France in 1939. When France fell in 1940, thousands of Jews fled south. They were incarcerated in the Riefseld transit camp, from where they were deported to Nazi concentration camps in 1942. Mary and her colleagues organized children's colonies and succeeded in saving hundreds of Jewish children from Nazis by bringing them to safety there. Mary died in 2002 and was awarded Righteous Among the Nations posthumously by Yad Vashem in 2013. Not only those Jews who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them her lives, but all of their descendants too. As the Talmudic verse teaches us, for he who saves one life is regarded as if he has saved the world entire.
A great number of Holocaust survivors made their homes in Israel after the war. I invite His Excellency, Mr. Ze'ev Boker, Ambassador of Israel, to give his reading about the close association with Israel and the Shoah.
I stand before you tonight as a representative of the State of Israel and the son of parents who, as young people, escaped Poland just before the forensics of the Nazi dictator and his miseries brought calamity to the world and the Shoah onto the Jewish people. My parents escaped to pre-state Israel and set about rebuilding their lives there. Sadly, most of the family who remained in Poland perished. As my parents began to try to build their shattered life and fight for an independent state of Israel and their ancient homeland, the last remains of the European Jewry emerged from the death camps, from the forest, and from the evil grip of the Nazis to try to rekindle their spark of life. My father made a decision to dedicate his life to bring these survivors to our homeland. He worked as an envoy for the Mossad Aliyah Bet, the Organization for Clandestine Immigration. In their darkest hour, the survivors of the Shoah found light in the fledgling Jewish state. They worked with all their might to build the state of Israel, to grow something from the ashes, to build protection and regain their independence. The foundation of the state of Israel were built with the historical lessons of the Shoah in mind. That is, another Holocaust will never be allowed to happen again. And Israel existed as an independent state. At the time of the Shoah, it could have prevented the extermination of many of our Jewish brethren. This year, Israel marks its 70 years anniversary of independence. 70 years ago, the Jewish people did not have the military might to defend itself. But today, things are different. Today, we have an army. We have the ability, the duty, the determination to defend ourselves. The state of Israel, which is a survivor of the Shoah, helped to build, is a modern, democratic state with strong morals, full of creativity and ingenuity. We will always remember our 6 million brothers and sisters who perished in the Holocaust. It's our duty to ensure that never again truly means never again. Humanity has no choice. We have a duty to learn from the lessons of the Holocaust, to turn strong and fight against anti-Semitism, battle of the Holocaust denial we see perpetrated by the Iranian regime, and condemn those we seek to demonize and even eradicate the state of Israel. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we should all remember the importance of the very existence of the state of Israel. Jews everywhere must know there is one place which will be their bastion, one place where they can feel safe, one place that guarantees there will be never another Shoah. That place is Israel, the nation state founded by we, the Jewish people.
Genocides have taken place over the centuries and still occur to this day. I invite Zlata Filipovic, who survived the war in Bosnia in 1995, to give her reading.
The Holocaust is the name given to one specific case of genocide that was unprecedented in its totality. The attempt to destroy the Jewish people of Europe and all traces of Jewish culture, history, and memory. By the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, concentration camps, and death camps. The genocide of the Roma took place during the Holocaust, as did the murder of thousands of others who were victims of the Nazi atrocities. In all cases of genocide, people have been targeted because of their ethnicity, religious beliefs, or cultural affiliations. In Armenia, over 1 million people were murdered between 1915 and 1923. In Cambodia, in the 70s, it is estimated that 2 million people were murdered by the Khmer Rouge. And in Rwanda, in the 90s, over 1 million people were slaughtered, often by neighbors and people they knew, who joined in the bands of killers in the face-to-face killings. In Bosnia, more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were massacred in Srebrenica in 1995, in the single largest mass murder in Europe since 1945. Genocide is not a single event in time, but a gradual process that begins when discrimination, racism, and hatred are not checked. For this reason, it is important that we respect one another, and when we see injustice, we speak out.
It is customary at Holocaust Memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish people who perished in the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of all of the other victims of Nazi atrocities. In memory of people with disabilities and disabling conditions, I invite John Dolan of Disability Federation of Ireland to give his reading.
The T4 euthanasia programme was the mass murder and forced sterilisation of thousands of disabled persons. The Nazis considered all people with intellectual and physical disabilities as life unworthy of life and as useless eaters. High school textbooks contained examples of maths problems, calculating the costs of care for people with disabilities compared to the costs of caring for a healthy person. Doctors and nurses collaborated in the use of lethal injections, starvation, and the murder in gas vans of disabled people. It is estimated that 300,000 people with disabilities and disabling conditions were murdered in the T4 euthanasia programme.
I invite Paul Alford of Inclusion Ireland and John Bradley to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of ethnic minorities, Poles, other Slavic peoples who were murdered in the Holocaust, I invite Amina Mustafa of the Africa Centre Ireland to give her reading.
Those who did not fit the Nazi image of the supreme Aryan race, such as Poles, Slavs, and ethnic minorities, were murdered, displaced, forcibly sterilised, and incarcerated in concentration camps. In addition to 3 million Polish Jews, it is estimated that more than 2 million non-Jewish Polish victims were also murdered in the Holocaust. Polish children were kidnapped and placed with German families to be Aryanized and reared as Germans. Commission number 3 was a program of forced sterilization of hundreds of people of African ancestry because the Nuremberg racial laws had stated that black people belonged to an inferior race. Thousands of other ethnic minorities were also victims of the Nazis.
I invite Liadon Kaminska and Kaja Kaminska, whose grandfather, Jan Kaminski, survived the Holocaust, to light their candles. We will always remember. It is estimated that as many as 500,000 Romani people were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. I invite Bianca Paun of the Roma Project to give her reading.
It is difficult to know the exact number of Roma people who were murdered by the Nazis, but estimates put the figure between 250,000 and 500,000. Hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people were rounded up, forced into ghettos, and deported to concentration and death camps. They wore an identifying black triangle on their camp uniforms, where they were subjected to brutality, starvation, disease, medical experiments, and gassed to death. In our language, we call the murder of the Romani people the parasmos, the great devouring.
I invite Demarius Paun and Jessica Paun of the Roma community to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the homosexual men and women who were persecuted and murdered during the Holocaust because of their sexual orientation, I invite Sarah Phillips, Chairperson, Transgender Equality Network Ireland, to give her reading.
The vibrant, cultural and inclusive society that was prevalent in Berlin in the 1930s changed dramatically when the Nazis came to power. Thousands of gay men were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps where they were subjected to harder work, less food and greater brutality than other inmates. Thousands were put to death. Lesbians were identified as asocials and treated as common criminals. The criminalization and social stigmatization of homosexuals in Europe and the United States remained in force for many years after World War II. Many homosexual survivors of Nazi persecution were not acknowledged as victims of the Holocaust. Some even had to serve out the terms of their original prison sentences, which did not take into account the time that they had spent incarcerated in concentration camps. For that reason, few homosexual survivors of the Holocaust ever told their stories.
I invite Oisin O'Reilly of Belong To and Andrew McCullough to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the political victims, I invite Kim Bielenberg, whose family members were opposed to Hitler and the Nazi regime, to give his reading.
The Nazis persecuted and murdered thousands of political opponents, some for what they did, some for what they refused to do, and some for what they were. Communists, trade unionists, and social democrats were brutally suppressed. Strikes were prohibited, trade unions and cooperatives were abolished, and their assets confiscated. In 1934, the Night of the Long Knives was Hitler's Great Purge, when he ruthlessly persecuted and murdered his political opponents in their hundreds, ridding the Nazi Party of those he distrusted, as well as anti-Nazi figures across Germany. As early as 1933, the Nazis established the first concentration camp, Dachau, as a place of detention for political prisoners. This was followed by Sachsenhausen and other camps a couple of years later. My maternal grandfather, Fritz Dietloff von der Schulenburg, was one of the key conspirators in the July plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. He was captured, tried before a so-called People's Court, found guilty, and executed.
I invite Noreen Hines of the Examinations Board at the Department of Education and Skills and Nancy Wallach of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the Christian victims of all denominations who were persecuted and murdered during the Holocaust, I invite Sister Stan of Focus Ireland to give her reading.
The Nazis persecuted and murdered Catholics, Protestants, and others of Christian affiliation. Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted for refusing to salute Hitler or to serve in the German army. Thousands of priests, nuns, and teachers were put to death for opposing the Nazis and for helping to save Jews during the Holocaust. We recall the Quakers who worked tirelessly to assist those trying to escape from Hitler's tyranny. There were many thousands of righteous Christians and thousands of Christian victims.
I invite Breed Dunn, chaplain of Portumna Community School, and the Reverend Mariah Jansen, Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, Waterford, to light their candles. we will always remember. 6 candles are dedicated to the memory of the 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million Jewish children who were annihilated in the Holocaust. Jews were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps. Jews perished in the ghettos. Jews died of starvation and disease. Jews were shot in the forests and in their villages, and Jews were murdered in the streets and in their homes. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, 2nd and 3rd generation. All of them lost countless members of their families in the Holocaust. I invite Tony Collis, whose grandfather Zoltan and great-aunt Edith survived Bergen-Belsen, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Kyla Herz, whose grandfather, Wolf Herz, survived the Drohitwich ghetto and escaped the massacre in the Bronnecke forest, and whose great-grandparents, Lenke and Avram Muskovich, survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, but whose many family members perished in the Holocaust. Mark Heinbach, whose grandparents, Heinrich Heinbach and Selma Heinbach, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Nurit Schulman, whose grandparents, Abraham and Emma Humburg, uncles, aunts, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Joe Katz, whose mother Frida survived Auschwitz, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Charlotte Kaplan, whose father Raphael Urbach survived Buchenwald and Theresienstadt, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember. The first Holocaust Memorial in Ireland was unveiled in 1995 in the Garden of Europe in Listowel, County Kerry. Paddy Fitzgibbon, who inaugurated the project, delivered a moving speech at the time. I invite Evelyn Byrne of Holocaust Education Trust Ireland to read an extract from Paddy's profound words on that occasion.
Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and shook the hands of some of those who survived. Go home from this place and tell your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren that today in Listowel you looked into eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic event ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered and still talked about and still wept over 10,000 years from now. Because if they are not, there will be no hope for us at all. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again. And every one of us, if only out of our own sense of self-preservation, has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.
I invite Rabbi Zalman Lent and Cantor Alwyn Schulman of the Irish Jewish community to recite the prayer for the repose of the souls of the departed. Please stand.
O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant grant proper rest on the sheltering wings of your divine presence. Among the holy and pure who shine like the brightness of the firmament, for the souls of all the holy and pure and innocent who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled at the hands of the Nazi oppressors in Auschwitz, Belzec, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other extermination camps in Europe. We now pray for those souls. May their resting places be in the Garden of Eden, and so may the Master of Mercy shelter them for eternity with the cover of his wings, and may he bind their souls in a bond of eternal life. May the Lord be their inheritance, and may they repose in peace upon their heavenly resting places, and let us say, Amen.
Enosh kechatzir yamav, ketzitz hasadeh ken yatzis, ki ruach averabo ve'yenenu ve'lo yakirenu ad mekomo ve'chesed Adonai me'olam ve'ad olam al yereyav ve'tzidkato libnei yevanim ve'tzidkato libnei yevanim. Amen. Amen.
During the Holocaust, civilized society became complicit in mass murder and genocide. Medicine and education were perverted for use in killing and disabling and in fomenting racism and hatred. As our annual Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony draws to a close, it is incumbent on every one of us here today, from whatever religious, ethnic, cultural, or political persuasion, to rededicate ourselves to truly eradicating racism from our midst, and to silence the voices that seek to deny that the Holocaust ever happened. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.